In this episode, we speak with Joe Britton. He's the executive director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association, or ZETA. They're working to make all new cars in the U.S. be electric by the year 2030. We discuss everything from the current automotive landscape, from impacts due to COVID, along with the current Biden administration and beyond. He shares how his team is working to make ZETA's vision a reality by the end of this decade. All right. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, appreciate you having me, and I'm always thrilled to talk about electrification in the transportation sector.
Well, I think what you're working on is awesome because it's been a topic that people have been talking about for so long. And it just seems like within the last 12 to 18 months, that there's finally getting traction in this area. You're seeing it globally with what's going on in China and Europe with a lot of these new kind of laws and kind of mandates for where they're trying to move the industry. Mm-hmm. And it's really great to see what you're doing here domestically. And I would love to just for you to give a quick overview for those that might not be familiar with your work and what you're trying to accomplish today.
Yeah, so the Zero Emission Transportation Association, we started about a year ago. A lot of that was kind of getting it up and running and recruiting folks to be on board. But there's been a lot of excitement. I think, like you mentioned, the timing has been right. But we're now at 53 companies. It's folks in the OEM, so the Lucid, Faraday, Lordstown, Rivian, Tesla. We've got battery folks like Panasonic and some recycling companies, all the major charging companies in the country, and then some material supply folks, so lithium and cobalt and copper, which are a key piece of obviously advanced batteries, and then a host of utilities. And so we've come together to support a pretty ambitious goal, which is that every vehicle sold by 2030 ought to be an EV. And that's, a lot of times when you talk about EVs, people think about the light duty side, but we actually think all 8 classes of vehicles ought to go electric. And that's an aspiration that has just garnered a lot of, I think, support and attention. I think the new administration plays into that. But, we think about our goals for 2050 and wanting to be, net zero, not only in the power sector, but in the transportation and throughout our economy. In order to get there, if you think about it, you've got to get to nearly every vehicle sold by 2030, maybe 2031, 2032. Otherwise, you're going to have people pulling up to the gas station in 2051 and 2052. And we know, at least from a climate standpoint, we can't be there. And in the interim, all the other benefits that an electric vehicle provides, which is, fuel and maintenance savings, lower mobile source pollution for frontline communities. It's a real public health crisis. And then if you think about the domestic manufacturing and the innovation and the job creation potential, the electric vehicle, again, through all 8 classes, can really be an answer to a lot of challenging questions that we face right now, which is why we're excited to advocate for it.
So let's take a quick step back, and you're doing this awesome work at ZETA. It's really making waves everywhere. And a lot of people are kind of talking about the initiative. Can we take a step back and learn a little bit about how you started this and kind of what you've been leading up to ZETA and your background in general, Joe?
Yeah, so I started in the U.S. Senate in 2003 and didn't leave for nearly 16 years. I did a brief stint with Secretary Vilsack, where I managed the Forest Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and then the Farm Service Agency for Vilsack. But otherwise, the rest of my adult life, I like to tell people I walked through the doors of the Hart Senate office building and worked for 3 great members. My home state senator was Ben Nelson. I then worked for Mark Udall from Colorado. His wife, Maggie Fox, was actually Al Gore's chief of staff for the Climate Reality Project. And then, like I said, a stint with Secretary Vilsack, who's now back at USDA, the Department of Agriculture. And I was chief of staff for Martin Heinrich from New Mexico for the last 4.5 years. And, really spent the last decade doing climate and conservation work. And the transportation sector, to me, is really, really exciting because One, it's the number one emitter of carbon emissions in our economy, and two, if you think about kind of the investments and the standards that we're seeking to make, the transportation sector is the biggest opportunity to decarbonize. And so, again, you can come at this stuff from a lot of different ways. I happen to, come at it from a political entry point, but it's just as important for local communities. It's just as important for consumers. I just, providentially found myself leaving public service and finding this really opportune time to, have the support of such a great collection of folks that are driving the electrification movement.
Great. And just to kind of go a little more in depth, when you go and look at kind of what ZETA stands for, there's quite a few different policy pillars of how you're looking to kind of make these impacts on the public level. Can you share what a few of those are and what you're working on today around those pillars?
Well, there's 34 of them, and I'll just spend the next 45 minutes going through those, if that's okay. We actually, the reason that we have such a diverse platform is we want to make room for a lot of members of Congress to be bought in and have opportunities to lead on this. So there's a host of recommendations that we're making that we think really drive the transportation electrification kind of movement forward. But the big drivers really are the consumer incentives on the light duty and then the medium and heavy duty side. And so what that looks like is a kind of a reformed 30D tax incentive, which is the consumer incentive right now. So it's the $7,500 tax credit that you get if you purchase an electric vehicle. Right now, both GM and Tesla are capped out. It's creating kind of a weird and maybe perverse incentive, which is that we're telling Americans that if they buy a domestically made car, they don't get the credit. But if they buy an import, they do, just because of the way the caps are set. So we want to get rid of that cap. We think there ought to be, and there's been good progress in both the House and the Senate on some secondary market and even vehicle exchange incentives to, again, drive adoption in the light duty space. In the medium and heavy duty side, we're advocating for a 30% investment tax credit. And that's not for the manufacturer, that's for the off-taker. So whether that's a utility, whether it's FedEx, it could be a small municipal fleet, they get a 30% tax credit for the purchase of a medium or heavy duty EV. The other thing that we do is there's a 12% excise tax, which is essentially a sales tax that the federal government levies on medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so we also think that, given the public interest of zero emissions, we ought to suspend that 12% federal excise tax for medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. And then what you need, so that's what drives the vehicles, drives adoption. You obviously need to build out then the charging infrastructure to get there. And so we're advocating for big federal investments in charging infrastructure. And, many folks are going to charge at home. So 70 to 80% in the light duty space, it's going to be a single family home with a level 1 or level 2 charger. But those other use cases are what we really want the federal government invested in. And that's transportation corridors, on-street parking, muni parking, multi-unit housing, sub-fleet applications. And so that's where the federal government can provide a lot of leadership and resources to help close the gap on charging. And then the final piece that I will leave you with is that, we really believe that EPA needs to and is going to be pursuing strong greenhouse gas and fuel economy standards. And so if you look back, the previous administration had unraveled many of the fuel economy standards, performance and emissions based that was driving electrification. And it's important because it's a market signal. So you need to have that strong, standard set by the government to make clear to both the capital markets and to those that are manufacturing and driving and creating new opportunities for EVs that this is something we're going to do and fully transition in the next 10 or 15 years, not the next 40 or 50 years.
That's great. And I think what's really great about your organization is you kind of hit the space hard. It's not just having, obviously, the big names like Rivian and Tesla and Lucid as a part of this. It's also kind of going across the whole supply chain. When you go to the website, you can see it's not just the companies, or the EV manufacturers, it's also the infrastructure. And it goes even further down to like mining and other materials who are part of this whole conversation. With this kind of full frontal approach, what do you see as, in your conversations, where do you see in these supply chains that people might have like the most, just maybe misinformed, or what still kind of stands out as some of the kind of the maybe legacy rumors and stuff like that.
Sure.
That in these conversations, you're starting to see big shifts in areas that having this full kind of supply chain approach with ZETA can really help address those front on.
Well, there's a few. I mean, people talk about range anxiety. I think most of the time it's more about change anxiety. People are just getting used to something that is new. We are going to, I think, see as automobiles in the kind of the advanced vehicle space, grow to a lower dollar amount per kilowatt. So right now, you think about on the cost side for a battery, once you get to about $100 per kilowatt hour for a battery, that's basically a price parity with an internal combustion engine vehicle. So we're blowing right through that. In the next 2 or 3 years, it's going to be $75 or $60 per kilowatt hour. And so on price alone, we will be out competing internal combustion engine vehicles. And as we do that, what that means is that also the range is going to be increasing. Obviously, your consumers are price sensitive, and so you don't want to have a battery pack that prices consumers out of the vehicle. So as that cost per kilowatt hour goes down, so does the potential ability to grow the battery size in an efficient way and to have ranges that are 400 to 500 miles. So if you think about your average, sedan, if you're going to fill up with a 16 to 18 gallon tank, you're going to be coming in at 390 to 420 range, and we're going to be exceeding that with many electric vehicles in the future. And so if you combine both a lower price point on the upfront costs, lower fuel service and maintenance costs, and a range that exceeds that of an internal combustion engine vehicle, for the consumer, it's just going to make enormous sense, both from an initial cost standpoint, but then the total cost of ownership. So I think that's really going to change, the culture around electrification. And the other thing, and I don't know if you've, driven many of these, certainly the newer models, the torque and the performance on these things is nowhere, they just outcompete an internal combustion engine in a host of ways. And so, they're funner to drive. It's a better experience. And the technology on these things just are far superior to an internal combustion engine vehicle.
With a lot of what ZETA is working on, and even this conversation we've already had today, a big kind of theme is around domestic manufacturing and production. Can you share some of the areas where you're just getting a lot of traction and kind of the interest to really build upon what ZETA is doing?
Yes, a full pillar of our plan is encouraging domestic manufacturing, and I think our view is that we have to go forward with strong incentives to build a capacity here for not only the vehicle but the components and the materials that we need for advanced batteries. And so, if you think about the full ecosystem, we have the capability to do it here. It's just a matter of building it out. And I think a couple examples that are really unique. If you look at the Rivian plant, it is a former Mitsubishi plant, internal combustion engine plant that was shuttered. So Rivian's taking it over. They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars and are going to employ thousands of people. So that's a true success story. Lordstown in Lordstown, Ohio, is the same story. It was a shuttered Chevy Cruze plant that they took over. They're putting in an enormous amount of investment, infusing into the ad economy and creating jobs. And, those are going to be jobs that are here to stay. They're good paying jobs. And I think that's, and it's in some ways a turnaround. That's a community that was left behind that is now going to be reemploying those very same individuals in this advanced vehicle space. The other thing I think, you're implying on the domestic side is materials. And so we actually have in the Carolinas and in Nevada a host of lithium plays. And so that's an important part of the future. We also have the ability, to produce some cobalt. There's copper production here. So those are also domestic manufacturing jobs. And many of them are in kind of your former carbon community that I think as we make a transition to a cleaner or net zero economy, those former carbon communities are especially important to ensure that we're creating additional or supplemental economic development. And we can go and do that as we think about the material supply side of an electric vehicle.
Yeah, I love the term you used earlier, change anxiety. So to kind of play on the inverse of what you discussed, can you share some of the maybe some of the road bumps you're running into, but are able to kind of bring people along? Or what are some of the challenges that ZETA is seeing and pushback maybe from the traditional combustion engine and fossil fuel industries?
Well, I mean, so there's a direct assault that's occurring right now. The American Petroleum Institute and the Petroleum Marketers Association, they've created a group called the Transportation Fairness Alliance. It is a totally DC named outfit and front group, but their goal is to go and slander EVs and utilities and charging companies. And so, we have to be out there on the playing field and fight back against some of the false narratives and kind of poll tested talking points that are out there. And, breaking through that, it's a little easier when you're on the right side of the issue. But being under-resourced and outgunned certainly makes it a challenge. But the more that we can go out there and actually tell the story of, whether it's the consumer benefits, the public health benefits, the decarbonization, the job creation, the American competitiveness, these are all things that are part of the future and are part of the transition that we're going to make. But it's about going and engaging with those communities and making sure that they see electric vehicles as right for them and their family and for the local economy.
Yeah, I think those are all great points to call out. And for people listening to this, what recommendations do you have to either get involved with ZETA, or do you think just on the kind of like in a grassroots way that they can make the biggest impact to help with some of these current issues?
Well, certainly we would invite them to go to zeta2030.org and sign up for our newsletter. We're going to be increasingly relying on kind of our community to help with advocacy. So not only do we represent and are made up of folks in the sector, but we're made up of a real army of people that are advocates for electric vehicles. And we partner with some of our colleagues, whether that's EV Hybrid Noir, who represents the black and brown EV owners and operators. You've got Plug-in America. You've got a host of other groups that we're constantly engaging with and strategizing on how to advance electrification. And so, if folks are interested, we would gladly have them enlist and be part of the advocacy campaign.
Great. And now that we've kind of built out a good base knowledge of the background around ZETA and some of the stuff you're working on right now, I think a few of the things we really got to talk about is the current landscape. Mm-hmm. So with where your focus is, can you share what you're seeing just kind of in DC around the new administration and kind of just the public kind of spheres of influence, and what kind of traction you're getting and what you're most excited about moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the elephant in the room is there going to be a big Build Back Better initiative to address infrastructure, jobs, climate change, et cetera. So I think that's kind of the open question. And even this week they're finishing up important COVID relief. I think our hope is that there's a quick pivot and turn to infrastructure and clean energy jobs, and certainly electrification. I think that's the thing that everything else in this space and everything else in DC revolves around that open question. So I think the administration has come in. They've made some very strong and bold early moves. They've committed to 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. Like I said, I know that EPA and and NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, are going to be pursuing jointly fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards. And so they're making progress. I think there's an open question as to whether there's going to be the will in Congress to, resolve all the outstanding disagreements that happen when you start talking about climate change. And so, I think that's why you see, the administration talking about Build Back Better and infrastructure and jobs. And everything gets, I think, is seen through that lens. So you could be addressing COVID, you could be addressing climate change, you could be addressing, the power sector, and it's all going to be, I think, approached or seen through the lens of how can we make this a stronger, more resilient American economy.
With these conversations that you're in, it sounds like that the domestic manufacturing is really the big way to kind of get over a lot of maybe the traditional pushback or other issues you run into. Is that kind of fair to say, or what have you found to be like a really effective way to move the conversation forward and really bring people of all different backgrounds together and see the value moving forward this way?
Well, so I actually think, and I think it's healthy for the democracy. I think one of the lessons that people took from the last several elections is that we need to do a better job of making the case that both parties are doing it. Whatever you're putting forward as your top priority, You need to be able to go to people and show that it's going to be good for them and their community. And part of the reason is, I think, certainly in times of turmoil, and people are strained, they get especially responsive or sensitive to how is this going to impact me as a voter. And so I think if you look at this last election, you look at the northern battleground, so your Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, you look at Arizona, you look at Georgia, there is, I think, a resonance with that kind of blue collar, working class, independent voter who is really they were trying to they're working two jobs trying to put food on the table, and unless you can speak to them in a meaningful way about what you're trying to accomplish, I think you're kind of automatically on the losing end. And so that's why I think both parties are increasingly trying to speak that language, which I think is healthy. And so for us, we believe that electric vehicles address and solve a variety of our challenges that we face as a country, and it's certainly good for the consumers. It's certainly good for climate change and for public health. But more importantly, as we address all those issues, it is an enormous potential to create jobs and really reshore domestic manufacturing. And if you look back to where we were, 10 or 12 years ago, if you look back at 2007, we got our lunch eaten by foreign imports that were more efficient than American-made vehicles. And, that's really the choice that we face. We can either cultivate this sector and take this spark of American ingenuity and turn it into a true success story, or we're going to be ceding this economic opportunity to foreign commercial interests and be reliant on imports. And so it's not just about today, it's about how do the decisions that we make over the next couple of years impact the next decade, and how does the next decade impact the next 3 decades. And so it's just really critically important to get this right, and getting it right means getting it right for local communities and creating jobs.
That's great. And I think one thing to just follow up for my own clarification, I know a lot of the companies that ZETA works with and a lot of the public policy pillars, fun tongue twister there, is kind of around domestic manufacturing. But at the end of the day, it is really about electric vehicles in general. Are there any sorts of maybe pushback or questions that kind of come up around, like you said, you've got Hyundai, you got VW, a lot of other global manufacturers are making some actually great, compelling electric vehicles today. What are some of the ways that that your organizations may be able to help them as well, just by getting more people in the seats and awareness of electric vehicles in general?
Well, the ecosystem is it's very distributed. So if you were to look back prior to World War II, you would have seen a vast number of automotive companies in the U.S. And after the war, that consolidated dramatically. We're now seeing the pendulum swing back the other direction. And there's, I think the reason that you're seeing the incumbents respond in the way that they have is they're receiving a lot of pressure from insurgent, aspiring companies. And I think that's really healthy. And I think when people are clamoring to meet the demands and the needs of consumers, I think it's healthy. It's what the market is for. And I think that's really where this is going, is that increasingly consumers, are going to be looking for a vehicle that meets their needs. And I think early on, and this is, you talk about some of the stumbles, I think the stigma of EVs was, it was a Nissan Leaf, and people didn't really envision the ability for their family to, pile in and go to the soccer practice and all the things that, you do. But now there's these, I think really, competitively priced and competitively capable vehicles that are coming to market. There's already 6 or 7 that are priced below the average price of a MSRP of a internal combustion engine sedan, but there's going to be hundreds of models coming out in the next 5 years. And so I think, and that's both going to be your Volvos and your Nissans. But I think what we're excited about is that, Ford and GM are making commitments, but then you've also got folks like Rivian and Lucid and Faraday and Lordstown and kind of the medium and heavy duty folks like Arrival and Proterra. They're going to be out there, answering the question for communities and families of how an electric vehicle can best serve their needs. And that's really exciting.
With all these kind of different brands we're talking about, there is an interesting dynamic, because we're talking about now foreign and domestic manufacturers, but we also have within domestically traditional auto OEMs, and then also kind of these startups, the Teslas, the Lucids, the Rivians. And one of the areas where the OEMs have kind of been different than the startups, I don't even know if you can really call most of them startups anymore because of their size, but it's around charging infrastructure and really making that kind of a seamless experience with that transition to an electric vehicle, making just easy and something you don't have to worry about. And that kind of goes back to that change anxiety thing. What are some of the things that you're working on at ZETA that you are kind of working towards to really help make that transition around charging infrastructure easier for drivers?
Well, so it's actually in some ways a antiquated view, in that right now, if you actually look at the plug, there's really only two plugs in the country, and it's almost like your cell phone, right? You've got your mini USB and your Lightning stick, and that's kind of how charging has developed in the light duty side. There's actually more harmonization on the medium and heavy duty side. It's, we're going to be moving towards a single plug, but even on the light duty side, it's two. Most cars come with an adapter, and I think the market is going to make it even more accessible for folks as we build out the charging infrastructure. So you've got companies like EVgo and EV Connect and EV Box and ChargePoint, and it's going to feel a little bit like, I don't know if you've ever been in the micro mobility or scooter space, but you're looking at 4 or 5 different apps looking for the right place to get a bike or a scooter, and it's going to feel like that initially on the charging infrastructure side, but increasingly, I think there's going to be just ubiquitous charging, and people, won't think twice about it. Kind of like, we've become accustomed to think about gas stations. Charging is going to be the same way, and it's, and I'm somebody that does it a lot. I tend to charge at home, but I can also go to the grocery store and charge. And I think increasingly, as it becomes normal to park in a retail setting and go into the store, or you're going to be at a movie, or you're going to be at school, or you're going to be at the office. Charging is just going to be an opportunity that you can face anywhere. So I actually think in some ways right now it's about sequencing. You want to be able to outpace the car, and so you want to make sure that there's enough charging to support the current vehicle fleet. But you also don't want to outpace it. You don't want to have so much that you have capital that sits idle and and it's unused. And so right now, we're in a healthy balance, and my expectation is with the right federal investments, we'll be able to keep pace with the vehicle fleet that's out there and adequately serve everybody's charging needs.
Well, I think that's actually kind of what I'm asking towards is, what do you think that federal incentive needs to be and to make sure we stay at that healthy balance? Because I agree with you overall. I think it's depending on the manufacturer, you run into some issues. But it's come a long way, because when I was driving an EV for the first time like 8 or 9 years ago, there weren't any. So it's night and day, and you're right. Majority of the time, people are just going to be charging at home, so it's not a huge thing. But being able to do kind of the great American road trip is a necessity for someone to really make that switch. And I'm just curious, because with a lot of these hardware improvements for charging infrastructure, I've been a part of some of these conversations, and there's all sorts of regulatory and other issues you just run into. And I'm curious what kind of frameworks or how ZETA can help maybe streamline that process and give information to utilities or others to really make it much more of a seamless experience, or for people who are curious about putting them in their gas stations or wherever. What kind of agenda and what kind of regulatory improvements, let's say, is ZETA kind of looking to help push forward?
Well, on the incentive side, there's an existing 30C tax credit, which is a 30% credit for the cost of installing a charging unit. We want to see that expanded and reformed, but there's already a base there and a precedent for it. What that looks like is, I think is really a base for a site host, a community, a utility, a third-party charging company to, say, hey, we'd like to pursue electrification and charging for this use case. And it's pretty flexible. I think, again, we want it to be expanded. But I actually think most communities are trying to figure out right now, for every sort of capital improvement or upgrade, whether it's building or transportation or other sorts of infrastructure, how are we going to make this meet our community's needs for the next 25 or 50 years? And electrification is just going to be part of that. So the demand is there. I think Certainly the leadership at the local level is there. And then you've got the right partners in place between the charging companies, the utilities, and the site hosts. And so, I think the biggest complement that we can provide to that is a strong federal incentive. The other thing that you could talk about from a regulatory standpoint is building codes. So providing, model building codes. So, let's say if you're building a new home, for example, it's just a lot easier on the front end to make it level 2 equipped and certainly capable of installing the charging. And then for commercial and other uses, there's what they call make ready, which is basically all of the architecture that's needed before you get putting the charging unit in the ground. And so the more of that gets done automatically as we're pursuing big capital projects, and certainly the federal government can lead by example, the better. And you're just making that adoption and transition to electrification, simpler and easier.
That's great. And I think a big part of that is kind of education to help support that. But I completely agree with you on that. So that is definitely great to hear. And I think the way forward. So let's kind of look back at everything that's happened in the past year. And I think there's two things, really big topics. And one of them is COVID. It's probably the biggest, obviously, that's affected everyone globally. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting, especially for automotive sales, because when you look at it domestically and globally, there was a huge nosedive in new car sales. However, globally, what's interesting is what actually went out was electric vehicle sales. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think a big part was people are seeing when people are driving less, there is actually a pretty strong correlation to cleaner air, mm-hmm. among with, and then the other part of that is just if you're looking at like the average transaction price of cars in general, it's been going up. So it actually kind of does work for EVs. What are you seeing around the conversation of like kind of takeaways or shifts in conversation since COVID, and how that's kind of impacting some of the work that you're doing with ZETA?
Well, I think ultimately one of the most impactful changes is, I think, a socialization that we need to invest in strategic ways in order to solve our society's problems. And I think we're federally. I certainly my hope is that we tend to match resources to problems, and we don't first have an austerity litmus test. I think some of the austerity politics of the past has led to some of the challenges that we face today, and that could be a ailing infrastructure in the country. It could be certainly a lapse and an inability to address climate change. So my hope is that we're entering a new era where we decide that taking on big challenges is worthy of the society that we live in. And if you look back at all of the kind of big upheavals and turmoil that we faced as a country, we've always emerged stronger because we were willing to take big, bold action to address them. And I think Bill Gates did a nice job over the weekend on some of the Sunday shows talking about how the resiliency and the impacts that we might confront and the needs for resiliency are going to be far more disruptive if we don't address climate change than what we're seeing with COVID right now. I think the way he described it is it'll blow COVID out of the water, some of the impacts and the humanity that we're going to be challenged by. And so, to me, that's my hope, is that people see what a disruption in life can look like, and it kind of brings to the fore that this is something that's possible. I think we've in some ways been seduced by this complacency that we don't need to try hard things and we don't need to act boldly because there's just this mean reversion of life that will coast and get us by. But when it's been taken away from you, like it has been for so many Americans, I think it's an opportunity for us to look and say, how do we do better? How do we actually invest in our communities and make smart decisions that that really make that sort of life and in pursuit of happiness a reality for folks.
That's great. One thing that just kind of popped up in my head is a conversation I've had around when you mention infrastructure, like how do you move this forward? Because a big thing that's figured into infrastructure traditionally is gas tax, both on federal and state. Mm-hmm. And they all kind of have different ways to approach it, especially when you get to the state level. But that is kind of becoming a conversation. I think in some ways it has been used almost as a way to kind of push back on EVs than an actual way to look about how to incentivize them and move them forward.
Yeah.
But it is a valid conversation, especially around like utilities with some of these upgrades they have to make and trying to figure out a way to do these upgrades so there are EVs can be driven for everyone. But then it's usually a cost that's getting passed on to everyone, whether they have an EV or not, as part of a ratepayer for these utilities.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so the 2 points, I guess I'll start with the utility side. So it is, that's one of the kind of the EV antagonist favorite argument is that everybody's electric bills are going to skyrocket. There was an example in the Carolinas where they pursued a pretty robust investment in EV charging. They got it approved by the state regulator. And I think the net impact on folks' electricity bills was 12 cents a month. So really what we're talking about here, it's kind of a scare tactic. It's cents, per month rather than dollars. And so I think, it's kind of a easy foil, for folks to go and try to, say that EVs are going to be the end of the world. The other on the infrastructure side, I think, we have the ability to finance a world-class infrastructure in this country. And, the gas tax has been broken for decades. And we've severed, years ago, we severed the gas tax and its adequacy to address our infrastructure needs. We take from the federal treasury and have for decades money to make sure that, that we're addressing failing infrastructure. And candidly, we've done a poor job at it. But still, it is, a minority of it is funded through the gas tax. Most of this comes from the federal treasury. And so, for 1% penetration for electric vehicles in a lot of regions to point the finger at EVs and say, it's the reason the gas tax is broken is pretty disingenuous. And so ultimately, I think where we need to move is a vehicle miles traveled in I think, a tech neutral way. And ultimately what folks have done, certainly state houses across the country, let's say, for example, your average gas tax that a consumer would pay in a given year, let's say is $100. What they'll do is they'll point the finger at EVs and then go charge $150 in an EV tax as a way to address what is the quote unquote inequity in it. But ultimately what that does is it's largely driven by the oil and gas interests and the refiners because they see it as an existential threat to their business model, and it's just punitive. And so ultimately what we need to get to is a system where it's a user fee and we have a real conversation about reform, and it's something that everybody contributes to fairly. And again, at the end of the day, it's something that most people don't think twice about, and we fairly and equitably, resource the challenges that we face as a country. And I think that's something that everybody wants to strive for. And it's not terribly complicated, but you've got a lot of political interests that are going to, scrum and fight for, their carbon supremacy over our economy along the way.
And I think that's a really great way to kind of break it down, because you're right. I would agree with you. Traditionally been a fallacy kind of argument made to kind of push back on EVs. But moving forward, I think that is one of the things, at least I've been seeing on a state level, is around that miles traveled or how to measure that, which is a whole nother conversation to itself. But thanks for sharing. I was curious about your thoughts on that. So we talked about COVID, and now to move it to kind of more recent topics. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's kind of what we've seen in Texas with failures in the grid and issues around charging, and how like utilities can look forward to kind of better build more resilient infrastructure, whether that be due to climate change issues or around greater adoption of electric vehicles. Can you share a little bit of what maybe those conversations have been at ZETA with utilities and what you're hearing and seeing kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I think ultimately there's a lot of lessons, I think, learned from the abject failure that the Texas ERCOT and communities all over Texas really suffered from. I think the most important thing to think about is we have the ability, and I think this is just a baseline, we have the ability to serve a load, from the power sector to consumers. It is a built architecture. It exists all over the country. It is a very efficient way to deliver fuel to heat people's homes, to certainly to power their vehicles and to power our economy. What happens is human error. And I think that's ultimately what happened in Texas. There was a failure to winterize to some degree. I think it was a distinct minority, but a failure to winterize some of the wind turbines. But by and large, this was such a cold snap that wellheads for the natural gas and other sorts of applications that pull up water along with gas and oil and others froze. And I think the numbers that I've seen showed that 80% of the failure was actually related to hydrocarbons, not renewable energy, and not a failure of the actual the grid. It was just a generation failure. And so to me, if I'm a Texan, the lesson that I take away from that is, one, hey, I'd sure like to be a part of a regional grid and not have a island that I live on for my power sector. Number one. Number two, and I think many people are thinking about this is, what can I do to have a more resilient personal power experience? And I think distributed energy, whether that's wind or solar, or certainly a solar plus storage is one way to do that. I think certainly if you look at the peak pricing in a really competitive market like Texas, there are people that got $8,000 utility bills. And so at that price point, it can make a lot of sense to make investments in solar panels or retail or residential storage capacity. And then that begs the question of how does the car fit in? And, there is some ability to do vehicle to home for power. I think there's probably greater potential for vehicle to grid. So let's say, this was the summer and you have 50,000 idled electric school buses that have, strong battery packs in them. There's a way to draw on, certainly at peak times, the energy from those stationary, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, and to even some extent light duty vehicles to serve the grid. And so I think that's part of the potential here is that the more penetration we have with electrification, the more resilient we can make the grid in a host of ways. And part of that was made possible by a recent FERC order, which was FERC Order 2222, which allows us to aggregate that power and sell it onto the wholesale market. And so that's a potential for your battery, not necessarily to be constantly cycling and feeding the grid, but your battery at those peak times when power spikes from $15 a megawatt hour to 300 or to 500 to provide some resiliency to the grid. And certainly if I'm a Texan and I've got a variable rate, when those prices peak, it sure will be a benefit for them to have some storage at the residential setting. So I think it is going to get people thinking about their needs and solutions in more creative ways. But I think by and large, I think you're going to see some reforms in Texas because again, I think most of the failure here was human. I mean, it was certainly a natural disaster and a natural challenge, but again, it was human failure that led to this.
Well, and I think not to make it sound like we're completely picking on Texas, this is something you're seeing even with I'm on the West Coast, so we're seeing it with obviously the wildfires. They're different kind of natural and kind of man-made elements playing into this, but the need for more distributed grid as well as kind of just more resilient is definitely a big trend we're seeing just across the country. You mentioned kind of the example of medium duty and someone who kind of works with a lot of these different manufacturers. I'm curious what your discussions have been and where you're seeing the examples of maybe vehicle to grid pilots start, because it does seem, and in my personal opinion, it does seem like the most common and what's going to make the most sense to start with, at least, is probably going to be on the medium and heavy duty side with fleets versus on the light duty, just due to warranty concerns and other things like that. Have you been kind of seeing similar trends, or are there any other kind of conversations you've been having with manufacturers that are kind of changing those thoughts?
Well, so I think the important thing, and this is why I think FERC Order 2222 is important, is that it provided for an aggregated, sale to play in the capacity markets and receive an ancillary service payment for either a positive or negative load that you're able to provide the grid. And so, I think the important thing to me, I think the biggest potential is vehicle to grid for that reason. And I think vehicle to home is a little more difficult. That constant cycling, I think there is some worry about degradation and what does that do over time? Does your battery range get impacted in ways that it otherwise wouldn't? I think that's what, you've got manufacturers that aren't dying to have their cars used in a way they didn't intend and have that impact range and their brand reputation. But, certainly a twice, maybe three times a year pull, from your battery in a two-way charging to be aggregated and deliver either a positive or negative load to the grid makes a lot of sense. And I think, you get paid a capacity payment, you get paid for the energy if you deliver it, but you also get paid an ancillary service. And so if you can aggregate that, I think it's actually a real value to the consumer and can help them, net out the economics of going electric. The other thing that I think is, really an interesting part of, the negative load essentially is, most people in the summer are going to come home, they're going to plug in their car and turn on their AC at the same time. And if you have a level 2 charger, most people are going to, reach their capacity limit on their battery in an hour or two. Maybe it's 4 hours, but that doesn't need to be between 6 and 10 at night. It can be between, midnight and 4 a.m. And so I think some management of when you charge and having that be part of the equation, so that you can, have a relationship with the grid that again, could provide a positive load at times, but certainly in a kind of a demand response space, ensure that at those peak times, that you're coordinating your energy flow in a way that makes economic sense for you. The other thing that I tend to think about is, if you're running one of these vehicle to grid or an aggregated program, there's a way for, consumers, let's say, you're going to go do a regional analysis and you're going to figure out when do those peak demands happen. And, most likely it's going to be the same hour or two of the day throughout the year, maybe 2 or 3 times. And so if you have some arrangement where you're aggregating a bunch of consumers that are willing to be, committed to having their car plugged in for a period of time, again, maybe that's light duty, maybe it's a school bus fleet, maybe it's municipal vehicles. There's a real potential there to create hundreds of millions of dollars of utility scale storage capacity just by coordinating human beings and how we behave. And so I think that's a really cool opportunity for people to make money and for us to make the grid more resilient.
That's great. I think what you're seeing around kind of that interest in vehicle to grid and the overall resiliency, is there conversations you've been having with the battery manufacturers of trying to get more, whether that be utility or even residential, like what maybe some more pro battery backup or just other kind of grid storage conversations? What have those been like? And is that kind of a separate issue, or is that all kind of falling into a lot of these topics? Because I feel like they are separate technologies, yes. But with all these themes that we're talking about right now, and really a lot of the people we have on grid connections, it is definitely a strong way of, or a strong part of having to, how we're going to move forward with all these other technologies.
Yeah, and we actually, I just earlier today had a conversation with the Energy Storage Association here in DC, but they are connected. Actually one of the most immediate connections, and I'm sure others have done this, but Rivian has done a good job of marketing the capability. But once a vehicle, hypothetically 15, 20 years from now, comes out of its full life cycle, and that battery, at least for Rivian, can be pulled out of the vehicle and stacked for immediate baseload storage capacity. So again, the performance may not be ideal for a vehicle anymore, but it's plenty good for your utility scale storage. And so there is a connection there. I think if you think about it, it's kind of second life. And then from second life, you get to recycling. And I think the recycling is really, really exciting because, if you can pull out 95% of the critical materials, that's not only a good commercial domestic manufacturing opportunity, but that's a huge part of the sustainability story here. You can use that same gram of cobalt, lithium, copper, graphite, nickel, over and over and over again. And some of the battery manufacturers will tell you that they actually prefer a recycled material rather than an extracted one. And certainly now the price points can be lower. And so, that all feeds into the same battery packs. Obviously the scale and the size changes with utilities use, but they're all connected. And I think they all have the same critical material supply chain. And the more that we cultivate that and secure it, I think certainly the price points come down, but also so does our independence and our ability to ensure that this market and economy thrives going forward.
Yeah, that's also another great point. I think the Second Life market. You don't really have to go far. You can do a quick Google search or just go on to YouTube to see for every wrecked Tesla or Nissan Leaf. Before it's even being used for something like that, there's become a huge market for people just going to junkyards and ripping these batteries out and using them in everything from repairing old cars to making them EVs to home systems or even other just randomly designed gadgets. But a big part of that is around kind of the sustainability part of it, which I completely agree with. I am curious, like when I went to ZETA, maybe I missed it, but one of the big conversations that still continues is around clean hydrogen as a form of sustainability. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts on how that plays into your conversations and how you look at that as part of this transformation moving forward. I think hydrogen has kind of left the conversations really when it comes to the light duty. It's still kind of there, but for the most part kind of gone away. You're seeing it really around trucking and then also around the grid. I would be curious to hear what you're seeing as well.
Yeah, in the transportation sector, the thing that people have to think about is that, we already have and have invested for, a century into a delivery system for electrons. It exists. It's already out there. I think to recreate that for hydrogen refueling is just really, really costly. And so I think what you may see is some long-haul trucking applications. Again, maybe the weight of the battery pack makes it something where it's comparable to think about the kinds of infrastructure investments you may need to deliver hydrogen. But I think really, where I see the biggest potential for hydrogen is in the marine, certainly, potentially aviation. You've got forklifts, you've got some other applications that it makes a lot of sense where, because transport is actually a huge cost of hydrogen. I think, certainly co-location where you're creating the hydrogen and use really makes the economics a little easier. So if you think through, utility scale hydrogen, almost always, the folks that are thinking about this in the right way co-locate, and they use it as an energy storage. So it's seasonal storage, it's peak storage. So, you're able to blend. I think certainly, you currently can blend about 30% into a gas peaker hydrogen into the mix. I think Siemens has some turbines that allow that. Obviously, with some retrofits, I think there's a hope that gets to 100%. But hydrogen is going to be a huge part of our decarbonization story. Certainly, the more that we promote, green hydrogen, where you're taking renewable energy in order to, power the electrolyzer and create the hydrogen. But, I don't see it as a pervasive part of our transportation sector. When you think about, most of the, the light duty, like I said, maybe some exceptions in kind of classes 4 through 8, and in forklifts and other things. But, I think ultimately, kind of your big industrial marine and your aviation, I think there's some hope there that it could be kind of that, that final squeeze that we need to decarbonize our economy.
Interesting. Okay, now that's good to know. I guess we're kind of coming up almost an hour here, and I'm curious to know. Obviously, you're very close to the public and the private side with what you're doing at ZETA. One of the questions I ask a lot of people who are on this show is like, what would you like to see? And we've talked about a few of these things, but what would you like to most see from the industry? Whether that be innovation in a technology or a more accessible regulation change. I'd just be curious to know what you'd most like to see come from the industry to make it easier for people to get into EVs and have kind of this impact on the grid.
Well, I think the most important thing for industry right now is to have strong domestic manufacturing capacity. And I know most of the companies in this ecosystem really, really want it. They know there's a demand for it, but part of our struggle is creating it. And I think that is not only a question for critical materials, but it's also, the ability for us to use incentives to build up that, components and supply and other sorts of ingredients that go into a vehicle. And so, that's the biggest challenge right now is, I think sometimes without the long or strong commitment or runway for a smaller manufacturing, component, they're just not really ready to retool. And so I think matching up and sequencing the assembly of a vehicle, the final assembly with the full, integrated supply chain is really what we need to get right. It'll answer the question for how do we best create jobs? How do we support domestic manufacturing? But it'll also, I think, fully tie in the political coalition that we need. I think where everybody can see this as a win for them and their family and their community is the place that we need to get to quickest. We've got the right, I think, answer, and this is the direction that we all need to go. And, certainly, like I said, it's better for the consumer, it's better for public health and the environment. And I think when we compare that with, clearly showing that it's better for job creation and domestic manufacturing, that's the full spectrum of where we need to get.
Great. Well, I just want to say thanks, Joe, for coming on to Grid Connections today. For those who are interested in learning more about ZETA and the work you're doing and maybe to become a part of it, where can they find out more and help your organization?
Yeah, so ZETA2030.org is our website. We've got our comprehensive 34-point plan, our roadmap to 2030 on how to electrify the transportation sector, and would encourage folks to also sign up for our newsletter. And we tend to give them not only an opportunity to join us in advocacy, but early kind of landscape level political reads of where things are going in Congress and where transportation electrification can really be accelerated.
Well, thank you, Joe, for joining us today, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been fun and eager to come back.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit our website, connectingthegrid.com. There you can listen to our podcasts, contact us about sponsorship, or even be a guest on Grid Connections. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a positive rating on your favorite podcast or video streaming service. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out a lot too. Thank you again, and I look forward to us learning more together soon.